Hello guys, I'm Zahir and today I'm going to be talking about Watchmen Chapter 2 and comparing it to Zack Snyder's 2009 movie. Let's get into it. Major spoilers for Watchmen throughout this video, guys. So when I saw the trailer for Watchmen in 2009, it said something like the seminal story, by Zack Snyder, and of course everyone had seen 300 up to that point, and I enjoyed 300 when I saw it back when it came out in 2006. So when I saw the trailer and they had that music from, I think it was Batman Forever, and it looked good, and I'd heard of the comic, but I knew nothing about it. I just heard that it was meant to be really, really good. I'm glad that I went into watching that film without knowing anything about the story, because what I wasn't expecting was to come across two of my favorite characters of all time. I just think Rorschach and Dr. Manhattan as characters, very, very different characters, well, very, very different, but also just absolutely incredible. Some of the most memorable lines from any movie that I've ever heard. I think acted by two really great actors. For me, at least, they're the kind of definitive portrayals of those two characters. Maybe it's just because I saw them first. Absolutely incredible. I'm glad to have been able to experience that story without knowing anything about it, or knowing that I had no idea that I was going to discover these two absolutely brilliant characters that have stayed with me. And I'm ashamed that it took that long for me to get a Dr. Manhattan or Watchmen t-shirt. So I'd say the major difference between the comic book Watchmen, which so sue me, I have not read, and the movie was the ending. Who is the great enemy that Adrian uses to try and unite humanity and try and end the standoff between the United States and the Soviet Union. In the movie, of course, he uses Dr. Manhattan. He kills, I think, 20 million people and then ends up blaming it on Dr. Manhattan. And of course, in the comic, as is the case in Watchmen Chapter 2, he ends up blaming it on a alien attack from some weird squid octopus creature thing. I'll be honest, I prefer the ending of the movie. I prefer it being Dr. Manhattan, but of course the opening of Watchmen Chapter 2 is the guy who wrote the in-universe story Tales of the Black Story talking to somebody else on this island somewhere, where Adrian has gathered a bunch of people to create this really realistic alien octopus squid thing, which he's going to use to attack multiple cities, I think, in the movie, but New York in the cartoon and the graphic novel. And of course they have little bits of Tales of the Black Freighter throughout this cartoon. They had it in Watchmen the movie, but of course that was in the extended cut, which I think came to something like 4 hours. So one of my favorite scenes in the movie, of course, is Rorschach in prison, because the guys in prison, they make it very clear that you're with a bunch of guys that you put away, or with guys who know people that you put away, and everyone hates you because you're Rorschach. You've been going around breaking people's fingers and beating them up on the streets, and now you're in the same prison as the rest of these guys. It's scary stuff, just the way you have this big guy comes along and starts talking to Rorschach, and he looks quite happy, and he has a shank, which is provided to him, at least in the cartoon. This is not the case in the movie, by the guy serving the food, who also happens to spit in Rorschach's food as well. But the scene in the movie is brilliant. That line, I mean, he kicks the hell out of the guy who's about to shank him, by the way. In the movie, at least, he breaks through some glass, picks up the oil, and then douses the guy in it. And in the cartoon, the oil's just there. He doesn't need to break into anything, which kind of doesn't make too much sense in a prison. You'd think that would be used as a weapon anyway. But anyway, he douses him in boiling oil, and then fights off another couple of guys. They've got the brilliant line, "I'm not locked in here of you, you're locked in here of me." I didn't really make it a secret in the last video that I did on this topic on Watchmen Chapter 1 that I do prefer the movie. It's my my preferred version of Watchmen. The cartoon still looks pretty good. I think the fight scenes, the animation looks really good. The fight scene between Rorschach where he's fighting off the guys in prison still looks good. One of the bits that was a bit more extended in this Watchmen Chapter 2 compared to the movie was Rorschach's background. So there is a bit about Rorschach's background, but we don't know anything about how he got the mask in the movie. And this is taken, of course, directly from the comic in the cartoon. They mentioned that he's working in some garment factory and he gets a special kind of material that's kind of 2 latex layers with ink in between, so it's constantly shifting, based upon temperature and movement. That material was apparently for Kita Genovese, and if anybody knows that story, it was the story, I think, in the 1960s of a woman who was killed. So they're bringing in some sort of real history into Watchmen, which is kind of a part of the whole thing. It's sort of set in the real world. I mean, it's set during the Cold War. And of course, it's after learning about what happened to Kita Genovese that he ends up taking that material and creating the mask, the iconic Rorschach mask. Of course, we go on to the story about, well, what took him from being Walter Kovacs to properly being Rorschach, being a guy who doesn't want to take off his mask, doesn't like being called Walter. At some point in this conversation between him and this therapist who's showing him these ink blot tests, the Rorschach test, he says, well, you're fat and wealthy. Like, you wouldn't understand anything, kind of thing. But the scene in the movie is much darker, and the movie, I think, is an 18. I think that that Watchmen Chapter 1 at least was a 15. I'd imagine that Watchmen Chapter 2 is also a 15. I'm using the UK ratings here rather than the US ones. The scene in the movie is much, much darker. I mean, literally dark. It takes place at night, and it's almost done like a horror scene by Zack Snyder. He breaks into the guy's apartment, where apparently this 6-year-old girl has gone missing, and the way the perpetrator ends up meeting his end is quite different. So of course in the movie, Rorschach comes across a meat cleaver, and he's talking to the guy who's tied up at this point, and he's the actor who's playing that perpetrator is he's much slimier in the movie. There's a bit of a kind of extended dialogue between the two, or I should say there's a monologue, because the guy himself is speaking and Rorschach is not really saying anything. He's just pointing out all of the evidence that's against him. And the guy's kind of like, oh, I've got problems, man. Arrest me, kind of thing. And of course, Rorschach at this point is not interested in arresting this guy and ends up putting a meat cleaver through his head. But I remember watching this in the cinema. Once was not enough, apparently, for Rorschach. He pulls it out and then does it another, I think, 3-4 times at least. So the guy's gone in a pretty gruesome, ugly manner. I don't know what happened in the comics, of course, but in the cartoon, of course, what happens is Rorschach just ends up setting the house ablaze and ends up leaving him there to die in the fire. He'd probably get killed by the smoke first, I think. Another one of the differences between this and the movie is that there's a lot more, I think, character development. There's a lot more of Dan and Laurie having a conversation, bonding. You see the romance between them. It kind of, I guess it makes more sense as it progresses that they've gotten together and that they end up becoming a couple, whereas in the movie it happens sort of quickly. They kind of make it make sense, I think. But there's just a little more character development on the lines of this, if that's what you're looking for. One of the things I liked in this was the effect on Archie. So Night Owl's aircraft that he uses to fly around. It looks really cool. It's kind of got this blue pulsating thing where the lights kind of pulsate out from the middle, up from the top, the sides and the bottom. It looks really cool. Then of course Laurie and Dan end up donning their costumes and then flying out in Archie to, I don't know, I guess they're going to look for some trouble. They're looking to try and remember what it was like to be out in those costumes beating up bad guys. And of course they come up against the tenement fire, which is the first kind of superhero type stuff that they've done in a very long time. The scene looks nice, of course, as I mentioned, the animation in this cartoon looks really good. I think the fire, the city, Archie as well looks really great. The costumes as well, I should mention, are much closer to their comic book counterparts. They're basically identical. I think that the humor in this scene also hits quite well. One of the guys who's being saved in the tenement fire says something like, you're that owl guy. And then there's a pause and he says, dark owl. And there's an awkward moment where Dan says, oh, well, would anyone like to listen to some music? I thought they did a good job. I think it hit the right notes. One of the things that I liked about Watchmen, of course, is the Cold War setting. The Cold War is my favorite period of history. And, if you're not a big history guy, they don't really beat you over the head with it. A lot of the Cold War stuff is in these little snippets of the news, little snippets of Nixon in his war room with his defense secretary. And a lot of it is just told through a newspaper headline. That's all you see. If you're not interested in the Soviets invading Afghanistan, then it's not going to impose itself too much on you as an audience member. But if you're like me, those little bits, I like the way that they did that. So a big part of the final act of the story is Laurie trying to convince Dr. Manhattan, God for all intents and purposes, to come back to Earth and to try and save Earth, as opposed to just running away and creating weird structures on Mars. The conversation in the cartoon is much longer than the one in the movie. I think that the one in the movie is actually a lot more simpler. I think the dialogue is much more simplified. I think that the way that they portray Dr. Manhattan's perception of time of as well is a bit longer too in the cartoon. There's a line where he says, this is where we debate Earth's destiny. And he says a few other things. He says, it commences when you surprise me with the news that you and Dan Dryberg are sleeping together. If I remember correctly, in the film, he sort of already knows that Dan and Laurie are seeing each other. Dr. Manhattan is essentially a determinist, right? He does not believe in free will, he says. We're all puppets. I can just see the strings. And that line, of course, is both in the movie and this chapter too as well. I don't know how long the theatrical version of Watchmen movie is. It's probably about 3 hours, but this is also about 3 hours in total, Watchmen Chapter 1 and Chapter 2, but they seem to be able to cover more, I think. And I think that they managed to do that by sort of combining scenes. So in Chapter 1, the scene where the comedian is killed and you have the two cops who are investigating this murder, those two scenes are combined in Chapter 1, where of course in the movie they're two different scenes. Another way that they seem to be able to cover more is just by having scenes go more quickly. Zack Snyder, of course, has a habit of slowing down a lot, and I think for the theatrical movie he used the comic book essentially as his storyboard. So a lot of those shots where it slows down are the shots from the comic book. The scene with Rorschach where he ends up killing this guy and ends up really kind of becoming Rorschach by killing this guy who kidnapped this girl. Well, in the cartoon, it's much shorter. It's much shorter. There's a bit more sort of dialogue at that point in the movie as well. So I don't know how it is that the cartoon manages to cover more while also being about the same length, but they managed to do it. The scenes on Mars with Laurie and Dr. Manhattan in the cartoon are, the thing is, sometimes they're just a bit too on the nose. They're just a bit too verbose. Back in 2009, when I saw the movie and Dr. Manhattan is talking about a thermodynamic miracle and how Laurie kind of is evidence, or is at least as incredible as a thermodynamic miracle, like turning oxygen into gold. When he's talking about that, he does it in, I would say, much less dialogue than they managed to do it in the cartoon. And it doesn't need to be so on the nose where I think it's Laurie or Dr. Manhattan says in the cartoon, there's lots of humans like me on Earth. And Dr. Manhattan is like, oh yes, yeah, there are lots of humans on Earth like you, and so they're all kind of a miracle in a way. You didn't need to be that pointed. You don't need to make it that explicit. You managed to do the exact same thing in the film without having to spell it out for your audience. So yeah, that's one of the reasons that I'll prefer the movie over the cartoon. perhaps the comic book, we'll see. I'll have to read that one day. So one thing to mention is the Tales of the Black Freighter. I don't know if this improves the story of Watchmen, and maybe it's because when I saw the theatrical cut, of course, Tales of the Black Freighter is not in that movie. You can only see that story if you watch the extended director's cut. And the thing with the Tales of the Black Freighter is I don't really understand it. Is the protagonist of that story meant to be Adrian? I think that's what they're trying to say. The line at the end, how had my noble intentions led to atrocity? I was a horror, and among horrors must I dwell. Like, I'm not entirely certain what they're trying to say. I mean, Bernie, the kid who's reading Tales of the Black Freighter himself, says the story doesn't make any sense. I didn't really get it. I'm like, oh, so this guy is trying to escape the Black Freighter, and then he's trying to get home before the Black Freighter reaches his dear wife and children, and then he ends up going back and then beating to death his wife in front of his kids. And then the townsfolk hear about this, and the mob forms, and they run after him, and then he swims out to the Black Freighter and sort of joins the Black Freighter. I don't really understand it. Is it that Adrian has to, I don't know. Adrian has to be the kind of guy that would beat his own wife to death to achieve what he achieves for world peace? I don't know. Maybe you guys can explain it. I don't really understand Tales from the Black Freighter. Maybe Alan Moore is just too damn smart for me. The Agent's conspiracy is a bit more sort of complicated in this cartoon than it is in the film. There's a number of different companies which Dan Drybag was looking at while he's investigating this and trying to figure out exactly what's going on. But all of that really are just kind of, they're red herrings. I think there's one organization, one company that's mentioned in the film, which is Pyramid Transnational, which is the organization that I think was giving Moloch his drugs and a few other things. In the cartoon, there's Dimensional Developments, and there's a couple others, which I think there's the Nova magazine, but shock horror, they're all owned by Adrian Veidt. The scene where Adrian carries out his plan still looks great. I mean, the one in the movie looks great as well, but Watchmen Chapter 2, same thing. I just think that the animation, the shots of the city, everything looks really, really nice. The electrical effects, the weird squid creature that appears, I think a really nice touch in the storytelling is showing all of these characters that you've already met in Watchmen. You see the two cops that were at the beginning of the story who are investigating the murder of the comedian. You see Bernie, the kid who's reading Tales of the Black Freighter. You see Bernard, the guy who's the selling stuff at the newspaper stand. You see the therapist who was interviewing Rorschach. You see all these characters that you already know, and of course they all end up dying. They all end up being killed by Adrian's plan to try and bring peace to the world. I think that was a nice little touch to kind of show that, hey, these however many millions of people in New York that Adrian is sacrificing for his plan, apparently for the greater good, they're not nameless, faceless people. They're human beings, and Adrian had to kill individuals in the same way that Dr. Manhattan was talking about each individual human being being a miracle in and of himself. He's had to kill all of these people. Once Adrian's plan is figured out, and of course, Dan and Rorschach and Laurie end up going to his base in the Arctic. Of course, a fight ensues. I did like the fight in the movie, actually, especially the bit where Rorschach is he's holding from a ledge with one hand, and then he drops, but he's Rorschach, so everything's really quiet, and he's sneaking up on Adrian, and of course completely fails to tackle him because Adrian's just too damn fast. Nice fight scene in Chapter 2 where Adrian is fighting both Rorschach and Night Owl, and he manages of course to beat the hell out of them without too much trouble. Until, Laurie ends up showing up with a gun, but we'll get to that. Just a small detail actually in Chapter 2 that was really cool. I think while Adrian is fighting Dan and he's fighting Rorschach, one of the things he does, and they only show it for a split second, is in the middle of the fight while Rorschach and Adrian are going hand to hand. Adrian, for a moment, grabs Rorschach's mask like he's about to put it off. Rorschach then goes to try and, keep it on. And then, of course, Adrian hits him and beats him. Just a kind of reminder that, for Rorschach, at least, the mask is his face. And if, he doesn't like having it taken off, like it was so traumatically taken off in the movie when Rorschach is first caught by the cops after the SWAT team scene. One of my favorite scenes from the movie was just at the point when we think that Dr. Manhattan has been killed by Adrian. He shows up and he's 50 foot tall or whatever it is, and then he's reaching through the roof to try and grab Adrian. And just some of the finest dialogue I've ever heard. Yeah, the line in this is just absolutely brilliant. I'm disappointed in you, Adrian. Very disappointed. Reassembling myself was the first thing that I learned to do. It didn't kill Osterman. Did you really think it would kill me? I have walked on the surface of the sun. I have witnessed events so tiny and so fast that they can hardly be said to have occurred at all. But you, Adrian, you are just a man. The smartest man in the world poses no more threat to me than does its smartest termite. This is that moment in the movie. I'm like, God damn. I mean, you know how powerful Dr. Manhattan is, but at this point, Adrian's just tried to kill him, and you still can't get rid of this guy, and now you've pissed him off. And he's essentially saying, you're a termite. Like, you're nothing compared to me. You couldn't stop me even if you tried to. This, I think, just like, to be fair, most of the scenes in Watchmen Chapter 2 compared to the movie, it hits much harder, I think, with real actors with real facial expressions. Whoever it is, whether it's Jeffrey Dean Morgan or Carl Gugino, or whether it's Jackie Earle Haley, it doesn't really matter. I think that all of the scenes just hit much harder in the movie than they do in Watchmen's Chapter 1 and Chapter 2. Another example of that, in the film, incredibly emotional scene where, Rorschach's not on board with this. He says, well, the world has to know. Like, everyone's going to find out what you did, Adrian, because he's not going to keep his mouth shut. And, of course, leading up to this, in Chapter 2, they show this as well. Rorschach is hanging off the side of Archie, and he drops his diary into the postbox. And he says, Rorschach's journal, final entry. Like, he knows he's not going to be coming back from this. He mentions as well that Adrian could kill both him and Dan single-handedly. The scene in the movie, there's a moment, and I just noticed this. I didn't know why this particular piece of music at the end of the theatrical movie is called All That Is Good. But the music starts playing at the moment where Nixon is on the TV saying, hey, I've been on the phone to Gorbachev of the Soviet Union, and, we're going to be looking at a better future for humanity and protecting all that is good. Something like that. That's the line. When he mentions the words, all that is good, the piece of music by Tyler Bates, who did the soundtrack for the 2009 movie, starts playing. Great piece of music. And just seeing Rorschach as he's walking out, and of course Rorschach, he does not compromise. He says, no compromise, even in the face of Armageddon. That's the difference between you and me, Dan. And the dialogue, of course, is a little bit different in Chapter 2 compared to the movie. Really emotional scene. I'd say this scene is the kind of the emotional high point, I think, of the movie. Rorschach is reaching his end, and he's alluded to it. I think he knows it. The story, of course, has been leading up to this point, and again, I don't know how much of this dialogue is in the comic. I'm going to need to read the comic at some point. But when I was watching this scene, I actually did watch it as though Rorschach were having a conversation with God. Because he says some stuff, and I'm just kind of thinking, is he talking to John? Is he talking to Dr. Manhattan? Because Dr. Manhattan is essentially a god, and he kind of represents God, I think, in the story. I think there's a few allusions to him being a type of God, if not God himself, or at least representing God in the story. And the reason that I feel as though he's having a conversation with God is just what he's saying. Again, am I reading too much into this? I don't know what you guys think. Pop a comment, like, subscribe, do the other things, so I can continue making this kind of content. If you like it, of course, let me know. Is this a conversation between Rorschach and God? He says, suddenly you discover humanity. If you'd cared from the start, none of this would have happened. And there's a tragedy to this, and in a sense, Watchmen kind of is a tragedy. All of the characters in it are tragic figures in one way or another, whether it's the comedian, whether it's Rorschach, whether it's Laurie, Dr. Manhattan, all of them are tragic figures. By the end of this, Rorschach is literally begging Dr. Manhattan to kill him. You've seen that he's this guy who's just been really hurt by life. The scene, and they showed it in this part in Watchmen Chapter 2, where Rorschach, young Walter Kovacs, is being bullied by a couple of kids who are older than him and mocking the fact that, well, his mother is a prostitute. And he gets one on the ground somehow and then bites his face and then tears a bit off. This guy's seen some stuff. Of course, you've got the scene as well where he kills the guy with with a meat cleaver in the movie and just burns the guy to death in Chapter 2. Rorschach has seen some shit. He's a bit of a mess. And so at the end of it, when you see Jackie Earle Haley's face, he's taken off the mask and he's literally he's begging Dr. Manhattan to do it. He says, do it. Up to this point, what he's done is he's done the only thing that he knows to do, which is to stand up for what he thinks is the correct thing to do. Whatever you might think of Rorschach, whatever you might think of his methods, whatever you might think of his, quite explicitly stated political opinions in the comic and in Chapter 2. Whatever you might think of him, he's somebody who stands by his convictions. Even at this point, even in the face of conviction, he says, people need to know. People need to know. I just think an incredibly powerful scene. I saw it as him having a conversation with God. I don't know if he even believes in God, but yeah, he says, suddenly you care about humanity. If you'd cared from the start, none of this would have happened. Do it. Essentially, he's saying to Dr. Manhattan, put me out of my misery. At this point, he's like, I've done what I can. He's posted his diary to the journalists and said, it's out of my hands at this point. He's done his work. It's time for him to die. There's much more in Chapter 2 about Adrian's kind of uncertainty about whether or not he's done the right thing. So he's just killed tens of millions of people. And he asks Dr. Manhattan, did I do the right thing, John? In the end, I was hoping it would be worth it in the end. And brilliant line again, it speaks to Alan Moore's writing, where he says, in the end, nothing ever ends. It's an allusion to the fact that, well, listen, after this, the story doesn't end. Humanity keeps going. There is no end point. Whether it's Ozymandias, I am Ozymandias, King of Kings, look upon my works, ye mighty in despair. Whether it's Alexander, or whether it's any of those guys who are thinking, well, I'm going to come along and I'm going to change the world and I'm going to do this thing which I think is worth it, is worth the price to be paid in human lives, trading millions of lives for billions. And there's an end point where, everything's great after that. It's all utopia. Because Adrian says quite explicitly at the end of Watchmen Chapter 2 that now that he's done that, now that he's averted World War III, he's now going to take humanity to utopia. And the thing about utopia is it's kind of delusional in the same way that Ozymandias was delusional. In the same way that Alexander did not come along and then create a system that endured, for all of humanity. Of course, he has left something of a legacy, I think, but, nothing ever ends, as Dr. Manhattan says. There's none of that uncertainty from Adrian, I think, in the film. Essentially he just kind of says, oh, well, I've made myself see the faces of all of the people that I've killed. He doesn't seem to have any doubt that he's done anything wrong here. I think having watched chapter 1 and chapter 2, the cartoons, it just made me appreciate the 2009 movie all the more, and reminded me just how much I loved it and just how much I loved Dr. Manhattan, Rorschach as characters. They're absolutely fantastic, and it speaks, I think, to Alan Moore's dialogue. Some of the lines in that movie just stick with me even today. And I have like a top 5 movies of all time, and the 5th movie I always struggle with, and it was between 2 different films. Actually, it was between Captain America: The Winter Soldier and Into the Spider-Verse, the first one. But I'm now having to kind of reconsider, like, hey, Watchmen was a great goddamn movie. It looks great, it sounds great, it's acted great, the dialogue's great, everything about it is great. Am I going to have to squeeze in Watchmen again into my top 5 favorite movies of all time? I don't know, but I just wanted to mention, just, this is a great film. This is a great film. If you haven't seen the film, 2009 film, go and see it. Anyway, guys, I know I probably ended up talking a lot more about Watchmen, the movie by Zack Snyder, than I did about Watchmen Chapter 2. But how did you find the cartoons, Watchmen Chapter 1 and Chapter 2? Did you enjoy them? How do you think they compared to the comic? I have read a bit of the comic, but I haven't completed it. How do you think it compared to the movie? Do you think that the movie was better? Do you agree, actually, that the ending from the film was better than what Alan Moore came up with in the comics? And so in Watchmen Chapter 2, what do you think about Rorschach? Is Rorschach having a conversation with the Almighty at the end, just before he dies? Or, is he just having a conversation with Dr. Manhattan at the end of the movie? Because, by the way, some of that dialogue about, suddenly you discover humanity, if you'd cared from the start, that was not at the end of Watchmen Chapter 2. But hey, pop me a comment, let me know what you think. Like, share, subscribe, do the other stuff. I want to continue making this kind of content, so if you liked it, please do those things as well. And beyond that, guys, I will bid you a good day and take care of yourselves. Goodbye.